The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls. Inside the private quarters, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat quietly by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The weight of the previous night's conversation with William still pressed heavily on her heart. The palace had been buzzing with unusual activity for weeks. Staff members moved with purpose but spoke in hushed tones, their faces carrying expressions of concern that hadn't been seen since the darkest days of the royal family's recent history. Something significant was happening, though the public remained unaware of the storm brewing behind the carefully maintained facade of royal duty. William had returned from his private meeting with his father, King Charles, looking older than his years. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and his usual confident stride had been replaced by something more measured, more deliberate. Catherine had learned to read these subtle changes in her husband over their years together, and what she saw now filled her with a deep sense of unease. The children had noticed too, though they couldn't quite understand what was different. Prince George had asked why his father seemed so quiet during breakfast, while Princess Charlotte had climbed into Catherine's lap that morning, sensing the tension in the air with the intuitive wisdom that children often possess. Little Prince Louis continued his cheerful chatter, blissfully unaware that the world around him was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The decision that weighed on William's shoulders was unlike any he had faced before. As second in line to the throne, he had always known that duty would eventually call him to make difficult choices, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The conversation with his father had revealed information that changed everything they thought they knew about their future, about their roles, and about what would be required of them in the coming months. Catherine understood the burden her husband carried, even without knowing all the details. She had watched him pace the length of their private sitting room the night before, running his hands through his hair in the way he did when wrestling with impossible decisions. When he finally spoke, his voice had been barely above a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real than he was ready to accept. The palace staff had been sworn to secrecy, but the tension was palpable throughout the corridors of Windsor. Even Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, seemed to move with an unusual heaviness in her step. The security detail had been quietly increased, though they maintained their professional demeanor that gave nothing away to any watching eyes. Outside the castle walls, life continued as normal for the millions of people across the United Kingdom who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity. They went about their daily routines, unaware that decisions were being made that would ripple through their lives and the life of their nation in ways both profound and lasting. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine that on this particular morning, she felt more alone than she had in years. Despite being surrounded by people whose lives revolved around serving and protecting her family, the isolation that came with royal duty had never felt more acute than it did in these moments when the most important conversations happened behind closed doors, away from the support systems that ordinary families might turn to in times of crisis. William joined her by the window, his presence both comforting and heavy with the weight of unspoken words. They stood together in silence, watching the groundskeepers tend to the gardens below, both knowing that this peaceful morning routine was about to become a memory they would treasure in the difficult days ahead. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside their private quarters announced the arrival of William's private secretary, a man whose discretion had been tested many times over the years, but never quite like this. The documents he carried would formalize decisions that had been made in the quiet hours of the previous evening. Decisions that would reshape not only their personal lives, but their public roles and responsibilities. Catherine reached for William's hand, feeling the familiar calluses from his years of military service and his more recent dedication to his royal duties. Their fingers intertwined with the practiced ease of a couple who had weathered many storms together, though neither of them spoke about the magnitude of the storm they were about to face. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room chimed 9 times, marking not just the hour but the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. Whatever came next would test everything they had learned about duty, sacrifice, and the delicate balance between their roles as public figures and their needs as a family. In the distance, the sounds of London waking up drifted through the morning air. Traffic hummed along the roads, children made their way to school, and people began another ordinary day in lives that would soon be touched by the extraordinary decision that William and Catherine were about to announce to the world. The weight of royal tradition pressed down on them both, generations of precedent and expectation that seemed to echo through the very stones of the castle around them. Yet in this moment they were simply a husband and wife facing an impossible choice, holding on to each other as they prepared to step into an uncertain future that would demand everything they had to give. The private secretary's knock interrupted the heavy silence that had settled over the room like a blanket. William straightened his shoulders, the transformation from worried husband to future king happening in the space of a single breath. Catherine watched this familiar shift with a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing how much strength it took for him to carry both roles simultaneously. The document spread across the mahogany desk told a story that few people in the world would ever fully understand. Medical reports, constitutional lawyers' opinions, and carefully worded statements that had been revised countless times over the past weeks. Each page represented hours of agonizing deliberation, consultation with advisors who had served the crown for decades, and phone calls to Commonwealth leaders who needed to be prepared for what was coming. Catherine moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the formal language that seemed so inadequate to capture the human cost of what they were about to do. The legal terminology felt cold and distant, completely removed from the tears that had been shed in private, the sleepless nights spent weighing impossible options, and the moments of doubt that had crept in during the darkest hours before dawn. William's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his pen, a barely perceptible shake that only Catherine would notice after years of knowing him so intimately. The signature he was about to give would change the course of not just their lives, but the lives of their children, and the future of the monarchy itself. The weight of that responsibility had been building for weeks, and now it threatened to overwhelm even his carefully maintained composure. The children were in their lessons with their tutors, their daily routine maintained with deliberate normalcy, even as the adult world around them prepared for upheaval. Catherine had insisted on this, knowing that Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis would need the anchor of familiar activities in the days to come. Their tutors had been briefed about the need for extra stability and patience, though they still didn't know the full scope of what was about to unfold. Outside, the media continued their regular coverage of royal activities, completely unaware that the biggest story of their careers was developing just beyond their reach. Royal correspondents filed their usual reports about upcoming engagements and charitable initiatives, having no idea that within hours, everything they thought they knew about the future of the British royal family would be turned upside down. The decision had not been made lightly or quickly. Months of private discussions had preceded this moment, conversations that had taken place in secure locations with advisors whose loyalty to the crown was absolute. Constitutional experts had been consulted, precedents had been researched, and the potential consequences had been analyzed from every possible angle. Yet despite all the preparation, nothing could truly ready them for the emotional reality of what they were about to do. Catherine thought about the phone calls she would need to make to her own family, the conversations that would be both easier and harder than the formal announcements that would soon be made to the world. Her parents had always supported her journey into royal life, but they had also witnessed firsthand the sacrifices it demanded. They would understand her pain in ways that the public never could. The private secretary cleared his throat gently, a reminder that time was moving forward whether they felt ready or not. The carefully coordinated timeline that had been developed over the past weeks was already in motion. Palace staff were preparing for what would be one of the most significant announcements in recent royal history, while security teams reviewed protocols for managing what was certain to be an unprecedented media response. William signed the first document with steady strokes, each letter formed with the precision that had been drilled into him from childhood. His education had prepared him for many aspects of royal duty, but no amount of constitutional study could have prepared him for the emotional complexity of this moment. The irony was not lost on him that all his training in duty and service had led to this decision that felt like the ultimate expression of both. Catherine placed her hand on his shoulder as he moved to the second document, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about their partnership. Throughout their marriage, they had faced challenges together, but nothing had tested their bond quite like this. The decision they were making would affect not just their public roles, but the most intimate aspects of their family life. The morning light had grown stronger, streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air above the desk. It seemed impossible that such a momentous decision could be made on what appeared to be an ordinary Tuesday morning, with the sounds of normal life continuing just outside their private world. As William's pen moved across the final signature line, Catherine found herself thinking about all the moments that had led them to this point. The early days of their courtship, when the possibility of a royal future seemed both exciting and distant. Their wedding day, when they had made vows that included serving their country together. The births of their children, each one bringing new joy but also new considerations about the kind of life they would lead. The documents were now complete. The decision officially recorded in the formal language that would soon be translated into public statements and news reports around the world. But for William and Catherine, sitting in the quiet of their private quarters, the real work was just beginning. They would need to find ways to explain to their children what was happening, to prepare for the intense scrutiny that would follow, and to navigate a future that was now completely different from anything they had imagined just a few months before. The news broke at exactly 2:47 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, sending shockwaves through newsrooms across the globe. The carefully worded statement released by Kensington Palace was brief, formal, and devastating in its implications. Within minutes, every major news network had interrupted their regular programming, and social media platforms exploded with reactions ranging from disbelief to heartbreak. Catherine stood in the nursery, holding Prince Louis close to her chest as she watched the coverage unfold on the small television that had been hastily brought in. The little boy played contentedly with the buttons on her cardigan, blissfully unaware that his name was being mentioned by news anchors around the world. She pressed her face into his soft hair, breathing in the innocent scent of childhood that seemed like a refuge from the storm raging beyond the palace walls. Down the hall, William was fielding phone calls from Commonwealth prime ministers, each conversation requiring him to explain and justify a decision that felt increasingly surreal with each retelling. The formal language he had practiced with his advisors felt inadequate when speaking to leaders who had worked closely with his family for years. Their shock was palpable even through the diplomatic politeness that characterized such conversations. Prince George and Princess Charlotte had been called back from their lessons, their tutors struggling to maintain normal routines while dealing with their own emotions about the announcement. The children sensed the change in atmosphere immediately, though they didn't yet understand what it meant for their lives. George, old enough to pick up on the gravity of adult conversations, had become unusually quiet, while Charlotte clung to her favorite stuffed animal with an intensity that broke Catherine's heart. The palace staff moved through their duties with professional efficiency, but Catherine could see the tears in the eyes of women who had helped care for her children, the tight-lipped expressions of men who had served the royal family for decades. These people had become like family over the years, sharing in the joys and sorrows of royal life behind the scenes, and now they were grappling with what this change would mean for their own futures. Outside the palace gates, crowds had begun to gather despite the short notice. People came carrying flowers, holding signs, and simply standing in shocked silence as they tried to process what they had heard. The usual mix of tourists and royal watchers had been joined by ordinary citizens who felt compelled to be present during this historic moment, even if they couldn't fully articulate why. Television commentators struggled to find appropriate words for what was unfolding. Royal experts who had spent years analyzing every aspect of the family's public life found themselves at a loss when confronted with something completely outside their experience. The carefully maintained narrative of royal duty and service that had defined William and Catherine's public image was being rewritten in real time. Catherine's phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family members who had learned the news along with the rest of the world. Her sister Pippa had called 3 times, her voice thick with emotion as she tried to offer support while processing her own shock. Their parents were driving to the palace, having dropped everything the moment they heard the announcement. The children's questions had started simply enough. Why were there so many people outside? Why did everyone look so sad? Why were Mummy and Daddy having so many grown-up conversations? Catherine and William had prepared answers for these moments, but the reality of explaining such complex decisions to young minds proved more difficult than any amount of preparation could address. International news crews were setting up outside every royal residence, their satellite trucks creating a carnival atmosphere that felt obscene, given the gravity of the situation. Reporters who had covered the royal family for years were being asked to provide context for something that had no real precedent in modern royal history. The phrase constitutional crisis was being used with increasing frequency, though most people using it weren't entirely sure what it meant in practical terms. William found a quiet moment to call his grandmother's closest friends, elderly women who had known the late Queen Elizabeth for decades, and who deserved to hear about this development from family rather than from news reports. These conversations were perhaps the most difficult of all, as he tried to explain decisions that even he sometimes questioned to people who had lived through every major change in the monarchy over the past century. The financial markets had reacted immediately to the news, with the pound fluctuating wildly as traders tried to assess what this meant for British stability. Constitutional lawyers were being pulled from their quiet academic lives to provide expert commentary on situations they had only ever discussed in theoretical terms. The machinery of modern media was struggling to keep pace with a story that seemed to defy all the usual categories and frameworks. Catherine watched the coverage with a mixture of fascination and horror, seeing their private pain translated into public spectacle. The photos being used by news outlets were all from happier times, images of family holidays and official engagements that now took on an almost nostalgic quality. She recognized the dress she was wearing in one photo, remembering the day it was taken and how different their concerns had been then. As evening approached, the reality of their decision began to settle in new ways. The children would need different security arrangements, different schooling considerations, different everything. The life they had built so carefully over the years was about to change in ways both subtle and profound, and they were only beginning to understand what that would mean for their family's daily existence. The evening news broadcasts painted a picture of a nation in shock. Across the United Kingdom, people gathered in pubs, community centers, and living rooms to discuss what this announcement meant for their country's future. The conversations were intense and emotional, with many expressing feelings of abandonment and confusion that surprised even seasoned political observers. Catherine's parents arrived at Windsor as the sun was setting, their faces etched with concern and love. Her mother enveloped her in the kind of hug that only a parent can provide, the kind that temporarily makes the adult world disappear and returns you to childhood safety. Her father, typically more reserved with his emotions, struggled to find words that could adequately express his support while also acknowledging the magnitude of what was happening. The children had been told as much as their ages could handle, with explanations carefully tailored to each child's level of understanding. Prince George, at 10 years old, grasped enough to ask difficult questions about what this meant for his own future. His serious expression as he processed the information reminded both William and Catherine of how much their eldest son already understood about duty and responsibility, knowledge that sometimes felt like a burden too heavy for such young shoulders. Princess Charlotte, always intuitive about emotions, seemed to sense the sadness around her more than she understood the specific details. She stayed close to Catherine throughout the evening, occasionally asking if everything was going to be okay with the earnest concern of a child who has learned that sometimes grown-ups don't have all the answers. Her questions were simple but cut straight to the heart of what everyone was feeling. Prince Louis, at 5 years old, was most affected by the change in routine and the number of new faces around the palace. His world had always been carefully structured to provide stability and normalcy, and the disruption to that routine was more concerning to him than any explanation about constitutional matters could be. He asked repeatedly when things would go back to normal, a question that none of the adults could answer with confidence. William spent the evening in his study, working through the logistical implications of their decision with a team of advisors who had been preparing for this possibility for weeks. The practical matters were staggering in their complexity: security arrangements, financial considerations, legal questions about titles and privileges, and coordination with government officials who were still processing the constitutional implications. The international response had been swift and varied. Commonwealth leaders expressed understanding, while privately worrying about what this meant for the future of the monarchy in their own countries. European royals reached out with messages of support, many of them sharing their own experiences with the challenges of balancing personal happiness with royal duty. The American media covered the story with the fascination they typically reserved for celebrity scandals, often missing the deeper constitutional significance. Social media had become a battlefield of opinions, with supporters and critics engaging in heated debates about duty, sacrifice, and the relevance of monarchy in the modern world. Hashtags supporting the family's decision competed with others condemning what some saw as an abandonment of responsibility. The intensity of public feeling surprised many. Observers who had assumed the British public was largely indifferent to royal affairs. Catherine found herself thinking about all the people whose lives would be affected by their decision in ways both large and small, the charities they had supported, the causes they had championed, the communities they had visited. All would need to adjust to a new reality. The staff members who had dedicated their careers to serving the royal family faced uncertainty about their own futures, adding another layer of guilt to an already complex emotional situation. The evening brought a parade of visitors, government officials who needed to understand the implications, religious leaders who offered spiritual counsel, and longtime family friends who simply wanted to show their support. Each conversation required William and Catherine to revisit their decision, to explain their reasoning, and to face the reactions of people they cared about and respected. As night fell, the media circus outside the palace gates intensified rather than diminished. Broadcast trucks lined the surrounding streets, their bright lights creating an artificial daylight that felt surreal against the historic backdrop of the royal residence. Reporters filed live updates every hour, though there was little new information to report beyond the initial announcement. The children were put to bed with extra care and attention, their bedtime routines extended to provide additional comfort and security. Catherine read an extra story. William spent longer with their prayers, and both parents lingered in the nursery longer than usual, watching their children sleep and wondering what kind of world they would wake up to in the coming days and weeks. The weight of public expectation pressed down on the palace like a physical force. Generations of precedent and tradition seemed to echo through the corridors, reminding everyone present of the magnitude of what was happening. Yet in the quiet moments between the phone calls and meetings, William and Catherine found themselves clinging to the certainty that they had made the right choice for their family, even if the cost was higher than they had imagined. Late into the night, messages continued to arrive from around the world. Old friends, distant relatives, former colleagues, and complete strangers all felt compelled to reach out during this moment of transition. The private secretary's office worked through the night to categorize and respond to what was becoming an overwhelming volume of correspondence. The palace that had been their home for years suddenly felt different, as if the building itself was holding its breath and waiting to see what would come next. The familiar rooms and corridors that had witnessed so much royal history were now part of a new chapter that no one could have predicted. Dawn broke gray and drizzling over London, the weather seeming to mirror the somber mood that had settled over the nation overnight. Catherine stood at the window of the breakfast room, watching the rain streak down the glass while behind her, the children ate their morning meal with unusual quietness. The normalcy of cereal bowls and juice cups felt almost surreal against the backdrop of the historic changes unfolding around them. The morning newspapers had arrived with headlines that would be remembered for generations. Farewell to the future king dominated the front page of the Times, while the Daily Mail opted for the more emotional, Kate's tears for the crown she'll never wear. Each publication tried to capture the magnitude of the story in bold typeface, but the words seemed inadequate to convey the human drama playing out behind palace walls. William had been awake since before sunrise, participating in conference calls with constitutional experts and government officials who were working to understand the full implications of the decision. The legal frameworks that governed royal succession had not been designed for this kind of voluntary transition, creating precedents that would influence the monarchy for generations to come. Each conversation revealed new complexities that no one had fully anticipated. The children's questions had evolved overnight, becoming more specific and harder to answer. Prince George wanted to know if they would still live in the same house, if he would still go to the same school, if his friends would treat him differently. Princess Charlotte asked if she was still a princess, a question that went straight to the heart of identity and belonging in ways that legal documents couldn't address. Prince Louis simply wanted to know when all the grown-ups would stop looking so sad. Catherine's day was filled with phone calls to the heads of charities and organizations she had supported as a working royal. Each conversation was emotionally difficult, as she tried to explain decisions that affected not just her family, but the countless causes and communities that had relied on royal patronage. The Cancer Research UK representative wept openly during their call, while the head of a children's mental health charity struggled to hide his disappointment despite his professional understanding. The international media attention had reached a fever pitch, with news crews from every major network in the world descending on London. The BBC had created special programming to analyze every aspect of the story, while American networks treated it with the same intensity typically reserved for presidential elections. Social media platforms crashed periodically under the volume of posts, comments, and reactions from people around the globe. Palace staff worked with quiet efficiency to manage the unprecedented situation, but the emotional toll was visible on every face. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served 3 generations of royals, was seen wiping away tears as she went about her duties. The security team maintained their professional demeanor, but their concern for the family they protected was evident in every gesture and glance. William met privately with his father, King Charles, in a conversation that had been dreaded by both men. The king's understanding of his son's decision was tempered by his own sense of duty and the weight of tradition that had shaped his entire life. Their relationship, already complex due to the unique pressures of royal succession, faced new challenges as they navigated this unprecedented situation together. The public reaction continued to evolve throughout the day, with opinion polls showing a nation deeply divided about the decision. Younger people expressed more understanding and support for prioritizing family happiness over duty, while older generations struggled with what they saw as an abandonment of responsibility to the nation. The generational divide reflected broader questions about the role of monarchy in modern society. Catherine spent time with each child individually, trying to provide the personal attention and reassurance they needed during this confusing time. With George, she had serious conversations about responsibility and choice, helping him understand that sometimes even adults have to make decisions that disappoint other people. Charlotte needed more emotional comfort, cuddling close while Catherine explained that love and family were the most important things, even when other things had to change. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of former royal staff, members who had retired years earlier, but felt compelled to show their support during this difficult time. Their presence provided a connection to the continuity of royal service, while also highlighting how unusual the current situation truly was. These veterans of royal life shared stories and offered perspective that helped put the current crisis in historical context. Religious leaders from various faiths reached out to offer spiritual guidance and support, recognizing that this was not just a constitutional matter, but a deeply personal struggle with duty, sacrifice, and faith. The Archbishop of Canterbury made a private visit, spending time in prayer and conversation with both William and Catherine as they sought clarity and peace in their decision. As evening approached, the family gathered for what would be one of their last dinners in the familiar setting of their royal residence. The conversation was subdued but loving, with each parent making extra effort to engage with the children's interests and concerns. The meal felt both ordinary and historic, a family dinner that was also a moment of transition that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The weight of public scrutiny continued to press down on every aspect of their lives, with photographers using long lenses to capture any movement around the palace grounds. The violation of privacy that came with royal life had always been a challenge, but during this period of vulnerability, it felt particularly invasive and painful. Security teams worked constantly to maintain some semblance of normal family life within the protected walls of their home. Late in the evening, Catherine found herself in the children's playroom, surrounded by toys and books that represented the innocent world her children inhabited. The contrast between their carefree artwork on the walls and the serious adult conversations happening throughout the palace highlighted the complexity of trying to protect childhood while managing a constitutional crisis. The third morning after the announcement brought a different kind of energy to the palace. The initial shock was beginning to give way to practical considerations and the hard work of managing a transition that no one had fully prepared for. Catherine woke to find detailed schedules and logistics plans covering her desk, each document representing another aspect of their lives that would need to be carefully managed in the coming weeks. The children had adapted with the resilience that often surprises adults. Though each showed their processing in different ways, Prince George had become more serious and thoughtful, asking detailed questions about what their new life would look like, and showing a maturity that both impressed and concerned his parents. Princess Charlotte had thrown herself into her art projects with unusual intensity, creating colorful drawings that seemed to help her work through emotions she couldn't yet put into words. Prince Louis had perhaps the most honest reaction of all, occasionally bursting into tears when routines changed or familiar faces weren't available. His emotional honesty provided a kind of relief in a world where everyone else was trying to maintain composure and dignity. When he cried, it gave the adults permission to acknowledge their own grief about what they were leaving behind. William spent his morning in meetings with Commonwealth representatives who had flown to London overnight. The ripple effects of their decision were being felt across nations that had grown accustomed to stability from the British monarchy. Prime ministers and governors general expressed their concerns while also acknowledging the deeply personal nature of the choice that had been made. The media coverage had evolved beyond simple reporting to deep analysis of what this meant for the future of constitutional monarchy. Academic experts who had studied royal history for decades found themselves in the unprecedented position of witnessing history being made, rather than simply analyzing it after the fact. Their commentary reflected both excitement at being part of such a significant moment and genuine uncertainty about what precedents were being set. Catherine's charitable work required careful transition planning, with each organization needing to understand how their royal patronage would be affected. The conversations were emotionally draining, as she had to say goodbye to causes that had become deeply meaningful to her over the years. The head of a homeless shelter she had supported broke down during their call, expressing fear that losing royal patronage would significantly impact their ability to raise funds and awareness. Public opinion continued to shift and evolve as people had time to process the initial shock. Support groups emerged on social media for people who felt personally affected by the decision, while others organized rallies expressing their continued loyalty to the family. The intensity of public feeling surprised political analysts who had assumed the British public was largely indifferent to royal affairs. The palace staff faced their own difficult transitions, with some choosing to seek positions elsewhere, rather than adapt to the new structure. Long-serving employees who had built their careers around royal service struggled with what this change meant for their own identities and futures. The human cost of constitutional change was becoming apparent in ways that legal experts had never fully considered. International relationships required delicate management, with diplomatic protocols needing adjustment to reflect the new reality. Foreign officials who had built relationships with William and Catherine over years of state visits and official functions now faced uncertainty about future interactions. The soft diplomacy that royal families provided was being disrupted in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years to come. Catherine found herself spending more time with her own parents, drawing strength from relationships that existed outside the royal bubble. Her mother's practical advice about managing children during times of change proved invaluable, while her father's steady presence provided emotional anchoring that felt increasingly precious. Their small family gatherings offered respite from the constitutional complexities surrounding them. The evening brought news that other European royal families were watching the situation closely, with some expressing private concerns about how this precedent might affect their own institutions. The interconnected nature of modern monarchy meant that decisions made in one country could influence public opinion and expectations across national boundaries. Educational consultants were brought in to help plan the children's schooling transitions, recognizing that their educational needs would change significantly with their altered status. The question of how much normalcy could be maintained while still providing appropriate security and privacy required careful consideration from experts who had dealt with similar situations in other contexts. William and Catherine spent their evening walking through the palace gardens, finding peace in the formal landscaping that had provided comfort to generations of royals before them. Their conversation was quiet and personal, focusing on their hopes for their children's futures rather than the constitutional implications of their choices. These private moments together had become increasingly precious as public demands on their time intensified. The financial implications of their decision were beginning to become clear, with teams of advisors working to understand everything from security costs to property arrangements. The intersection of personal choice and public resources created complexities that required navigation through legal and ethical territories that had rarely been explored. Late into the night, messages continued to arrive from around the world, though the tone had shifted from shock to acceptance and offers of support. Friends from their university days, colleagues from William's military service, and acquaintances from years of royal duties all reached out to express understanding and love. The personal relationships they had built over the years proved to be sources of strength during this period of public scrutiny and change. 6 months had passed since the announcement that shook the world, and the morning sun streamed through the windows of their new home with a gentleness that felt like blessing. Catherine stood in the kitchen of their private residence, a space that was smaller but infinitely more peaceful than the grand rooms they had left behind. The simplicity of making breakfast for her family without the watchful eyes of staff felt like a luxury she had never expected to experience. The children had adapted remarkably well to their new life, though each continued to process the change in their own way. Prince George, now 11, had found his footing at his new school and was forming friendships based on shared interests rather than royal protocol. His questions about their decision had evolved from confusion to understanding, and occasionally he would express relief that his future was no longer predetermined by birth order and constitutional law. Princess Charlotte had blossomed in ways that surprised everyone, her natural leadership qualities emerging more freely without the constraints of royal expectations. Her art had become more vibrant and confident, filling their new home with color and creativity. She had recently started a small fundraising project at school for a local animal shelter, showing that her instinct for service remained strong even outside the formal structure of royal duty. Prince Louis, now 6, had perhaps made the most seamless transition of all. His world had always revolved around family rather than protocol, and he seemed to thrive in an environment where spontaneous hugs and loud laughter were encouraged rather than carefully managed. His joy was infectious, reminding his parents daily that they had made the right choice for their children's happiness and emotional health. William had found unexpected fulfillment in his new role as a private citizen, though the adjustment had not been without challenges. The absence of constant security details and rigid schedules had taken time to get used to, but he had discovered freedoms he hadn't experienced since his university days. His work with environmental conservation groups had continued, though now from a position of passionate advocate rather than royal patron. The public's reaction had evolved significantly over the months. Initial anger and disappointment had gradually given way to a grudging respect for the family's courage in choosing personal happiness over duty. Opinion polls showed that while many still disagreed with their decision, most people had come to understand the human motivations behind it. The royal family had become more relatable in their choice to prioritize family over tradition. Catherine's transition from royal life to private citizenship had been perhaps the most complex, as she had to rediscover her identity outside of royal duty. Her work with early childhood development had continued through a new foundation she had established, allowing her to pursue her passions without the constraints of royal protocol. The freedom to speak more personally about causes she cared about had energized her in ways she hadn't expected. The media attention had gradually decreased, though it had never entirely disappeared. The family had learned to navigate their new relationship with public interest, setting boundaries that protected their privacy while still acknowledging the continued fascination with their story. They had become symbols of personal choice and courage, inspiring others who faced their own difficult decisions about duty versus happiness. Their new home buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life. Homework spread across the dining room table, sports equipment by the door, and children's voices calling to each other from different rooms. The contrast with their former life was stark, but the authenticity of their daily experiences felt like a gift they had given themselves and their children. William often reflected on the weight that had lifted from his shoulders since stepping away from royal duty. The constant awareness of representing something larger than himself had been replaced by the simpler but more profound responsibility of being present for his family. His relationship with Catherine had deepened as they navigated this transition together, rediscovering each other outside the roles that had defined them for so long. The children's bedtime routine had become one of Catherine's favorite parts of each day, Without the constraints of official schedules and royal obligations, she could linger over stories, engage in silly conversations, and simply be present in ways that royal duty had often prevented. The intimacy of these ordinary moments felt revolutionary after years of carefully managed family time. King Charles had maintained a relationship with his son and grandchildren, though it had required careful navigation and mutual respect for the different paths they had chosen. Family gatherings were smaller and more private now, but they carried an authenticity that had sometimes been difficult to achieve within the formal structure of royal life. As evenings settled over their home, William and Catherine often found themselves on their small terrace, watching the children play in their garden. The sounds were those of any family: laughter, friendly arguments over games, the occasional tears over scraped knees, but for them, these ordinary moments represented the extraordinary freedom they had fought to achieve. The legacy of their decision would be debated by historians and constitutional experts for generations, but for William and Catherine, the measure of success was simpler and more immediate. It was found in Prince George's excited description of a school project, in Princess Charlotte's unself-conscious laughter, in Prince Louis's confident assumption that his parents would always be available when he needed them. The farewell that had once shattered a nation had ultimately become a beginning rather than an ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of service, to family, to authentic values, and to the belief that sometimes the most courageous choice is to step away from what others expect in order to honor what the heart knows to be true. Their story continued, to unfold each day in small moments and quiet decisions, proving that happiness and meaning could be found in choosing love over duty, authenticity over expectation, and family over the weight of a crown that no longer felt like theirs to bear.